This is the final day of our Faraday summer course here in Cambridge, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hilary Marlow, who is our first speaker this morning. Hilary is graduate tutor and fellow of Girton College here in Cambridge and an affiliated lecturer in the School of Divinity at this university. Until recently, she worked with us in the Faraday Institute, and in fact, not many years ago, stood exactly in this place doing this job. But she's now, but she more recently worked in the Faraday Institute on a Templeton-funded research project on the theme of science and scripture in Christianity and Islam. And her ongoing academic research focuses on the use of the Bible in environmental ethics. And so that's the theme of her talk that she's going to give us this morning. So please welcome Hilary.
Everybody hear me? So I sort of feel I'm here but not quite here because I have no responsibilities. I just swanned in yesterday afternoon and again this morning, and it's all happening and it's wonderful. So that's really great. So I wonder, we're faced in the news pretty well, you know, every day it seems, with some issue that's raising awareness of environmental concerns globally, whether it's plastics or drought, and you know we're experiencing a minor sort of a heat wave here that reminds us what it must be like in other parts of the world, or bushfires due to heat and so on. So every day it seems we hear something new that might make us want to think about how we respond. And there are a number of different ways that people respond when they hear about environmental concerns. And the first one is fear or anxiety, a feeling that, this is all terrible, we're doomed, which for those of you not from the UK is an expression from a very well-known comedy program from the 1970s, I guess. Or perhaps guilt. You know, perhaps that's another expression, a way people respond. They feel guilty. This is a problem and we're not doing anything about it. Other people just put their head in the sand and don't think about it. They ignore it. They hope it'll go away. They don't want to consider it. This is not their problem. They can't fix it, so why should they bother about it? Others, and I'm talking now about people of religion, might think, well, this is God's world, let's leave him to sort the problem out. We may have made a mess of things, but God's all-powerful, he can do anything he wants, he'll put everything right in the end. And then the final take, and I found this from Christians in particular, is a kind of sort of otherworldly attitude that says, well, this world is just temporary, material, I have a better spiritual home that I'm going to, and I don't need to worry about the physical material world. And then, I haven't got a little graphic for this, there's a group of people that kind of have a sort of slight self-justifying approach. They say, well, of course I do my bit, I recycle, or I do this, but perhaps think that that's enough, that all that needs to happen is that we need to recycle a bit more, and that will sort the problems out. Now, it's no doubt in my mind that none of these responses have any real credibility. They're not ones that I think are justifiable from an ethical point of view, from a religious point of view, from a Christian point of view. And it's no doubt to me that we need different kind of reaction, a reaction of action, of serious action, both at global levels, at national levels, locally, individually, to try and reverse some of the effects that we see of climate change, of habitat loss, global population increase, the increasing demands for resources, the increasing production of waste that human society and technology generates. And of course, how to go about this on the kind of scale that's needed to really tackle these issues is a big problem. It's a huge problem. And it raises all kinds of ethical and practical questions. And really what I want to do this morning is to think a little bit about why this might matter and what are the theological and ethical principles that might undergird our responses. And I want to focus a little bit as a sort of way into this on a particular area, and that's in the area of conservation biology or biodiversity conservation. It's an area that I've been involved in quite a bit as in a charity I'm involved with. And I want to think about how we view the natural world and what effect that might have on our ethical choices. First of all, I want us to consider a couple of contrasting approaches on how we value nature that you find in the kind of secular world or in wider society. Oh, first of all, I should say that Cambridge is home to a large number of conservation charities. A lot of them have their headquarters here. A lot of them, mostly, they are international, and they do incredible work all around the world in monitoring the natural world, preserving endangered habitats and species. And of course, they themselves sometimes face really difficult decisions. They have competing demands on them in terms of money and time, but there are bigger questions that they face. Oh, sorry, a few slides I've introduced that aren't in my script. Let's just talk about that. When we think about conserving wild nature, perhaps we think about these species. These are the iconic ones, the ones that we find campaigns about, and we give money maybe to support preserving the panda or the Sumatran tiger or whatever. But what about all the animals that are not so pretty but are also at risk? These are also endangered species, but they don't kind of win the beauty contest awards. And you know, there's questions there about what do we value? Do we value a polar bear because it looks kind of cute and not cuddly, but at least from a distance, or a panda? How much do we value these creatures that don't look beautiful in our eyes? There's a society that is dedicated, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way, to fight for these ugly animals. And they do it, as I say, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but they have a point that they're trying to make, that actually how we value things, it has all sorts of subjective questions behind it, and what we might think is valuable to preserve from aesthetic point of view, from our own point of view, might be far less valuable than some of those creatures that I showed you in terms of kind of ecosystem and ecology. But anyway, the Ugly Animal Society held a competition for the ugliest animal out there. And this was the results. The blobfish. Now, I just want to put this up to give credit to the blobfish. He may be ugly, but he won a prize. So, conservation biologists face all these difficult questions, balancing human and wild nature needs. When is it okay to intervene in nature? Should we, for example, cull invasive species? We have debates about that in the UK. Should we prevent extinctions? How much should science interfere to prevent extinction? So, for example, on the news yesterday, I listened to something which was about the northern white rhino. Now, there are only 2 females left in the wild and no males, but they have preserved the sperm of the male northern white rhino, and they're trying to create test tube northern white rhino babies. So, is this the way to do it? And there was a voice on there, one of the people they interviewed, saying, well, actually, no, our priority needs to be ensuring that other versions of the white rhino don't die out, that we work on the ground, not just doing it in the lab. Maybe both are needed. What about the damage we've already caused? Habitats that have been destroyed by human activity. Should we, for example, a UK question, reintroduce large predators into the Scottish Highlands? Because the deer that are now everywhere there are actually destroying a whole amount of the ecosystem, and because there are no predators over them since the lynx and the wolf and so on went extinct in Scotland. And what are the unforeseen consequences of intervention? I mean, given the complexity of natural systems, what damage might we do by trying to solve one problem and creating others elsewhere? And then another question that we'll come on to later that conservation scientists face is the practical one. How do we encourage and empower local communities to care for their own backyard, to really do something themselves? So those are difficult questions. We're not going to answer them all, but it's worth thinking about them. But there are even bigger questions again around the whole idea of conservation. Is there such a thing as wild nature? What is it? And how does it relate to human society and culture? How do we value nature at all? Why should we care about what happens to other species? What is the point for a conservation biologist of engaging in this? There was an interview by a BBC journalist, John Humphreys, on the Today programme some while ago, and it was some question over biodiversity loss, and he was interviewing a conservation biologist, and he just asked this guy, well, why should we care if this species goes extinct? And he said that the person being interviewed was stumped and didn't have an answer to that question. Just couldn't come out with any sort of ethical, moral reason why we should care, why the rest of the world, why his audience should care about this particular species. And that's a really big issue. Why spend time and money on conservation biology, on preserving species that have no known benefit to human society? On what do we base the ethics of conservation? And there are scientists working out of Cambridge that spend their entire research careers investigating some small and unknown to most of us species in the depths of a Sumatran forest, say, that have no particular connection with our lives as far as we can tell. And yet they would say that is valuable. But the question I want to press to them actually is why? What makes it valuable? Where do you get your ethics of value from? Well, there have been attempts to answer the question, why conserve wild nature, made in various quarters, and why we should care. And I want to highlight three now. Two are what you might call at opposite ends of the secular spectrum. In other words, they have no religious component. And they really are at really opposite ends, and there's all sorts of nuances in between. But I'm going to set the two ends of the spectrum out. They're not necessarily either or, but it's worth thinking about them. And they both come from within the conservation biology community, or at least within the environmental community. And then the first is biocentric approach, the second is an anthropocentric approach, and then I'm going to talk about what a theocentric approach might look like. So let's think about a biocentric approach, and I'm going to talk about something called biophilia, literally the love of bios, life. And this is something that was put forward by E.O. Wilson, as an emeritus professor of biology in Harvard, the founder of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. And he coined this phrase, biophilia, to talk about the innate value and intrinsic value of nature. And he said that we have a tendency, natural tendency to love nature, to be lovers of nature. He said biophilia is the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organizations. Innate means hereditary and hence part of human nature. So he's saying there's an inbuilt something within us that loves nature. Now, you may want to think whether those two images I showed of, the tiger and the panda and the polar bear compared to the ugly animals, whether that kind of fits or not with that. And he says it's a basis for ethics of conserving nature that is based on this biophilia and comes out of our genetic makeup. It's time to invent moral reasoning of a new and more powerful kind to look at the very roots of motivation and understand why, in what circumstances and on which occasions we cherish and protect life. The elements from which a deep conservation ethic might be constructed include the impetus and biased forms of learning loosely classified as biophilia. So he's making a case that this biophilia leads into an ethic of conservation. So there are some concerns about his approach. By his own admission, there is no empirical evidence for biophilia. It's, in his words, just a hunch. So that itself might alert us to some concerns about it. And of course, not everybody has this innate love of nature. And perhaps there are people here in the room that really would rather go to a shopping mall than go out into wild nature and get exposed to all those bugs and cowpats underfoot and all the rest of it. Wilson himself talks about the opposite of biophilia, which is biophobia, the fear of nature. And there is, within human beings, an innate fear of snakes. And in fact, a friend and colleague of Faraday, Alistair Coles, has said that actually the knee-jerk reaction away from a snake is so intuitive that it doesn't kind of go through the sensory processing parts of the brain. It's almost a sort of instinctive reflex. So that's something also potentially built into our genetic makeup. And I still struggle with this basic question that this view highlights, is explaining how a genetic product of evolutionary biology, if that's what it is, can lead to powerful moral reasoning. It seems to me that there's a mismatch there. Okay, that's E.O. Wilson's. I want to talk now about an example of what I call an anthropocentric, or perhaps we might say a utilitarian approach to questions concerning wild nature. And that's what's called ecosystem services valuation. And this is something that has been current for probably the last decade or so, which is attempting to put a value on the services, in inverted commas, that nature provides to human beings. So it's very much centered about what human beings need. And a DEFRA report in 2007 said, ecosystem services are the wide range of valuable benefits that a natural, healthy environment provides for people, either directly or indirectly. So it's predicated on what humans need, and it sees wild nature in that terms. And it's essentially an economic model, and it's predicated on the idea that the natural world is a resource for human consumption, and we need to value it, but we need to make estimations based entirely on what it is to us as human beings. There have been two key reports that have highlighted this. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 25 looked at the benefits that humans derive from ecosystem and divided them into four different kind of benefits. Those that support life, things like soil, the nutrients in soil, phosphates and so on. Those that provide things that humans need, food, water, fuel, wood. Those that regulate the biosphere, an ecosystem, so things like climate, flood relief, things that nature can do, the way that nature can enhance prevention or cure of diseases, and then cultural aspects. Quite a very small part of the report looked at cultural aspects, so the aesthetic value of nature and so on, and an even smaller part of the research looked at the way nature might be valuable in religious terms, very, very small part of it. And then there was later another report that was published in 2009, and this is really trying to make this valuing of nature, valuing biodiversity and ecosystems, a feature of decision making. So it's trying to turn it into policy. It's a very structured approach to valuation. It supposedly helps decision makers recognize the range of benefits of ecosystems and biodiversity, but demonstrating their values in economic terms and capturing those in decision making. So it's making decisions based on which bits of nature are going to be more economically valuable to humanity, locally, nationally, globally. So very much focused on both economics and human beings. And there are some really big questions that this produces. Where do you stop with the valuation? Do you value the sun, the wind? How do you quantify that? The danger is it commodifies nature. In the conservation biology sector, when they are using the economics to value nature, it replaces decisions based on the ecology, the needs of conservation. It potentially depletes biodiversity. It doesn't take account of species that have no known value to humanity. How can you value in monetary terms things like cultural or aesthetic or religious experiences of nature? It's very much open to what we might call false accounting and corruption, very much open to serving political and corporate greed and agendas. And you can see how any valuation on economic terms can be sort of shifted and subject to bias, shall we say, for a particular end. And actually takes no account of what the economic cost of lost ecosystems might be. Actually, scientists and economists are more and more seeing that there is economic value in preserving what we have and in working to enhance it rather than in exploiting it and depleting it. I would say that my summary of the economic valuation is it may have its benefits, it may have its uses in difficult decision making, but it's very much a useful servant at times, but a very, very poor master. And here's a quote. No, I haven't got that quote. Okay, right, I want to move on now to think a little bit about a theocentric perspective. What does faith have to do with ecology, with conservation biology? What can religious belief and understanding throw into the mix, and how might it affect our actions, our attitudes, and so on? I'm speaking as a Christian, so I'm going to be looking primarily later on at the Christian tradition. I think that quite a number of the things that I say in this next few moments would be applicable to other faiths, and certainly a lot of the faith traditions are really thinking hard about how their faith responds to environmental issues and questions. So just to start off with, though, there's been an increasing recognition in the scientific community that actually that what they're doing is not making any inroads. And so Gus Beth said, I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do this. That's a real honest evaluation from a scientist who, as far as I know, has no religious faith, but is admitting that we tried with science to change things and we failed. And now we need spiritual, religious motivation to make a difference. And of course, if you look at the percentage of the world population that is religious, as this pie chart shows, 84% would say they adhere to some form of religious belief, whether it's the mainstream Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or various other smaller religions, including traditional religions. And only 16% of the world's population said they were non-religious, whatever they meant by that. So religion has a huge part to play in addressing these questions. So let's think a little bit more now in some detail about Christian faith and responding to ecological issues. And this is what I call a theocentric perspective. And in a theocentric perspective, all creational value is derived value, in that God the Creator is the one who authoritatively declares and demonstrates the value of all things he has made. Only after we are clear about this can we venture to say that an entity has intrinsic value. So I'm going to be thinking mainly from the biblical tradition at first, and then we're going to look at some responses from the Christian ethical tradition. And there are some overarching kind of points to make at the very outset when we talk about it. And this is one of them, that the Bible, and therefore, the Christian tradition is theocentric. It is centered around theos, around God. It's not either anthropocentric or biocentric. It doesn't sit anywhere on that spectrum. It takes a different perspective. And in that respect, it differs from current debates. So this theocentric perspective gives a new take on this language of intrinsic value of nature or utilitarian value of nature that we saw in the biocentric and the anthropocentric perspectives. It's theocentric, and that makes a difference. The second overarching picture we might want to highlight from the biblical tradition is that the biblical picture is relational. It's about the relationship, not just between God and humanity, although that has been the way that the church has viewed it for centuries, but also the relationship between God and non-human creation, the relationships between God and the land, the relationships between human beings and the land. I've got a little diagram here that kind of imperfectly captures it. It's a development of a diagram I used in my PhD, but with God at the center. In the biblical tradition, in the Old Testament in particular, you have lots of human beings there. You have a lot about the land. The land is very important, and agriculture and the way that the land is cared for or not is important. And then there's wild nature as well. And there are all kinds of ways in which those aspects interact. And if you are someone that reads the Old Testament, next time you go to it, have a little look and see if you can see ways in which human beings are reacting with the land or with wild nature as well as interacting with God. And of course, the Bible is the story of God and the whole world, not just God and the Israelites in the Old Testament, or God and the New Testament church in the New Testament, or God and humanity, as so many people have explored it over the past. And we need to correct that, what I would call an anthropocentric perspective in reading the Bible, that it's all about us. It's all about us and our relationship with God. I think it's far, far more. It's about God and his world in the biggest sense. And that includes, I would suggest, those ugly animals that I had up there. And you might like to think about, if God values everything, what his response is to those animals. Okay, let's think a little bit more detail about the world of the Old Testament. Now, we have to be honest and say that the world that it is speaking into is an agrarian society. So there's an awful lot in there about crops, about farming, about livestock, about all the issues surrounding being pastoral and agricultural people in a context where that was the expression. And so from that point of view, in many ways, wild nature was a resource to be used, and sometimes even a threat to protect against. Remember the stories of David the shepherd boy with his sling that he used to protect his father's flocks from wild animals. So in many ways, there is that perspective in the Old Testament. We have to be completely honest about that and say that in one sense there is that sense that it's humans against wild nature. It's a need to sort of protect their life, their livelihood from wild nature. But I would say that's not the whole picture. The Bible does not have a wholly anthropocentric or a wholly utilitarian view of nature. And here are several reasons why. Always in the Old Testament, the way farming is done is circumscribed by laws and regulations. And these are designed for two things. One is to maintain productivity, but also the other is to preserve the integrity of the land and to make sure animals are cared for. So the whole institution in the laws of the Old Testament for the Sabbath year, where the land lies fallow for a year, is to preserve, and that the whole point of fallowing a field is, in the days before we had intensive fertilizers, is to allow it to recover its balance of nutrients and the microbes in order to be productive again. And so the laws are geared up to letting the land recover, to not exploiting it, to not over-farming it, to not misusing it. And some of the laws about letting the land lie fallow stipulate that it's so that wild animals, as well as widows and orphans, are able to gather from what grows in that final 7th year. It's specifically to allow the ecosystem to recover in order to benefit the whole. A number of the authors of the Old Testament were so obviously themselves keen observers of the natural world. They were the forerunners of some of the great nature writers of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, people like Gilbert White and Thoreau and John Muir. They are foreshadowed by some of these Old Testament authors, and some of whom held up the natural world as an example and saw it as a place where the order, the correct functioning of the world was demonstrated for human beings to see and take note of. So this is probably, even the stork in the heavens knows its times, and the turtle dove, swallow and crane observe the time of their coming, but my people do not know the ordinance of the Lord. Referring undoubtedly to migration and observing the migration patterns and the coming and going and the cycle of animals, and say, you know, this is something that these creatures know instinctively, and we still don't know to this day exactly how migration functions and how birds navigate all the way from South Africa to the UK and back again twice a year. You know, it's incredibly complex how that happens. But, says the author of Jeremiah, this happens innately. They know what to do, but people don't know how to behave towards God. The biblical world of the Old Testament is full of references to biodiversity, huge variety of animals and species, habitats celebrated. Particular examples would be Psalm 104, if you wanted to look that up, and Job 39 to 40. So here are some of the species that are referenced in Job 39, the mountain goat, the ostrich, the auroch, now extinct, and the eagle. Actually, in the Old Testament, there were 110 different plant names and 208 animal names, which includes 90 mammals and 42 birds. So that's a vast range of species that are included in what is really a very, very small body of material. And it indicates that the authors were out there, they were connecting with the world of nature. They were observing it, they were seeing it, they were using nature to inform their language richly and metaphorically. And sometimes in the case of Job, they were using it as a way to just kind of reduce human presumption down and down and down. The text of Job 39 says, well, it's God addressing Job and saying, well, do you know when the mountain goat gives birth? Do you know how this happens? Do you know how the eagle gets its prey? And it's kind of just forcing Job to confront his limited understanding, which also then speaks to his limited understanding of why things have gone so badly wrong for him. I'm not going to deviate into the question of whether the book of Job actually answers Job's questions or not. Those of you that are familiar with it will know that, as I do suspect, that it doesn't actually. But it does confront Job with this vast panorama of nature and say, the world is bigger than you are, and it's bigger than you think. From a theological perspective, there are several reasons why we could say that nature has value, because it's created and sustained by God, as a number of the Psalms and Genesis 1 make clear. And of course, that's not, as you will have learnt over the course of this week, that's not a statement that's at odds with evolutionary biology, but it's a theocentric perspective on the diversity of world. All nature is created and sustained by God, even ugly animals. God values it as a whole. When we read at the end of Genesis 1 that God has finished creating everything over the days of creation, we read, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And that all is significant. He didn't just see humans that he'd made. Oh, great, this is the top of the pile. I've done a great job here, if I may paraphrase, with apologies to John Walton. But it's the totality, the whole thing. And I would suggest the whole thing working as a biosphere, as an ecosystem, or as multiple ecosystems. The created order, we're told in the Psalms, has purpose. It points us to God. Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. Day to day, they tell forth his praise. Psalm 148 invites the whole of the world, the created world, to praise God. Mountains, trees, animals, people, rich and poor, suggesting that praise and worshipping God is not a unique human activity. It's not just what humans do. It's actually a function of the whole of creation. And we could have a discussion about how other beings praise God, but that seems to me an important part of the purpose of the created world as a whole, is to offer back to God praise. And of course the question then comes as, well, what moral responsibility do we have if through our actions a creature becomes extinct and therefore cannot offer that praise to God that it was created to do? There are big questions there, and I suggest that we do have responsibility in that case. I want to move on very quickly to touch on the New Testament. I'm aware my time is going to run out. Only very briefly, because actually we need to remember that the New Testament presumes the Old Testament understanding, all that I've said about the Old Testament, of God and his creation. So all of that is assumed and taken into the New Testament. And of course, Jesus's and Paul's scriptures are the scriptures that we now call the Old Testament. So they bring into their teaching all of that understanding. And if you look at the accounts of the birth and the life and the death of Christ, there are many instances where wild nature is somehow involved, or the natural world, or the created world is somehow involved in different ways, both theologically and practically. So, for example, if we think in terms of Jesus' teaching, the parables draw on a wide range of natural understanding and imagery, agricultural and also wild, to illustrate, just as the Old Testament does, to illustrate the points that Jesus is making. But also, if you look at the birth and the death narratives of Jesus, you find that the natural world, the created world in the broadest sense, is involved. Think of the star that travels. You know, there's something strange going on in astronomy there that's happening to foretell the birth of Christ. And likewise, at the end of the Gospels, Christ's death, earthquakes, things happening, the sun darkening, there's all sorts of phenomena going on where the natural world is involved somehow in responding to this. The New Testament makes it clear too that the whole of creation, that's all of the natural world, is included in the Christian doctrines of atonement and of eschatology. So in Colossians 1, it talks about Christ being the one through whom all things were made, but also the one through whom, through his blood, all things are reconciled to God. So the whole of creation is caught up in the Christian view of what Christ's death on the cross achieved, the atonement, the reconciliation of human beings, of the world, to God. And then at the end of the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, we read the vision of the end is that there will be a new earth as well as a new heaven, and that all living creatures, all of creation, will praise God. And then enigmatically in Revelation 11, I think, and God's judgment will be for those who destroy the earth. Really telling remark there. And then in Romans 8, Paul talks about the way that creation is groaning as it yearns for its fulfillment, and it's basically waiting for human beings to step up to the mark, to take their place, to fulfill their God-given creation mandate, to be those that both serve the earth and also rule over it wisely, taking Genesis 2 and Genesis 1 there. Okay, that's a very brief skirt through some of the biblical material, and if I can do a little unashamed self-plug, I have written a short booklet that you'll find on the bookstall called The Earth is the Lord's, and it goes through the Old and the New Testament, picking out some of these themes of how we can respond to environmental issues through the biblical text. So if you're interested, you can pick that up for a very cheap price, I believe. I want to think a little bit now about responding ethically, and I want to think about how some of the Christian ethical principles might shape environmental decision-making and the way we respond to the issues. And of course, there is a very long Christian tradition, Christian ethical tradition of the virtues, of cultivating virtues, and mostly those have been seen vis-a-vis our relationship with other human beings. But I'd like to suggest that these are broader, and we can broaden them out to think about our relationship with the natural world. This isn't going to be exhaustive, it's just a few ideas. Oh, there's another couple of creatures from Job. So, I'd like to start with the Pope's encyclical. I think this is a wonderful call, and a highlighting of the issues, and a call to being different. And interestingly, he doesn't write just to Catholics. There's very little Catholic doctrine in there, 1 or 2 paragraphs, that's all right at the end. He doesn't even, I think, write exclusively to Christians. I think that he does talk about biblical texts, but I think much of it would be relevant to people of other faith traditions, and especially perhaps the other Abrahamic traditions. And I think he also deliberately goes beyond religion to talk about values and ethics in a broader way. And although he's obviously talking in a theocentric perspective, I think his work has resonance out and beyond religious communities. And in fact, I've given talks including here in Cambridge at secular groups, unpacking what's going on in the encyclical. So it's got quite a lot of currency around the world. He says this: living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It's not an optional or secondary aspect of our Christian experience. I think he's addressing there a key, a sort of fallacy that creeps in, which is that green issues, environmental issues, are sort of an add-on. If you're a keen green Christian or a keen environmentalist, you think about these things. But for the rest of people, it's just a secondary aspect. He's saying this is actually at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. What kind of things then might we think about when we think about this life of virtue? I think I've got 4 or 5 here. The first is justice. We read a lot in the Old Testament about justice for those that are less well off. You must not deprive them of justice. You must not exploit them. You must deal generously with those that are oppressed to undo injustice. And of course, environmental issues are one of the big justice issues that we face, because there is a huge rich-poor divide over how you deal with what's happening. And that is both globally in terms of the West being the generators of pollution and CO2 gases and waste products, and the global South often being, well, the recipients of our disused computers with all their contamination, and the ones that suffer the effects of global warming because of the increased levels of drought and erratic rainfall patterns and extreme weather events. So there's a huge justice-injustice issue. And that's even true within supposedly affluent societies. In the 2010, was it? New Orleans, 2008, I'm looking at Roger, New Orleans flooding, 2005, sorry, I'm a few years out of date. But in 2005, in the New Orleans flooding that occurred after the hurricane, you know, the people that died were the poorest of the poor. They were people without transport, who didn't have anyone looking out for them and so on. You know, and the rich had their cars to get away and so on. So even within a supposedly affluent society, the poor suffer the effects. Poverty has a huge impact on biodiversity loss, because when you're on the margin, the bread margin, you actually do use resources in an unsustainable way. And there are, you know, rainforests being cut down for agricultural land, forest wood being sold so that farmers can pay school fees and so on. And this is what happens when there's such a big inequity in wealth in the global population. And then, of course, the impact of multinationals and the economic system. I would say the growth model that the world subscribes to is itself unsustainable. We do not have enough resources to grow in the way that economists have been trying to persuade us to. And that raises all sorts of other ethical problems we can unpack in the question time about the emerging nations' economies, you know, and aspirations to have Western levels of lifestyle. And that's, yes, that's a really valid point. We can unpack that in the question time. The Pope said this: a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The two cannot be separated. They have to be brought together. So that's justice. A second ethical issue or virtue is that of restraint. Cultivating the virtue of just only having what we need. And that really addresses our consumerist society, doesn't it? Where we actually are told, bombarded with slogans to say, actually, it's not what you need, it's what you want. So gather, gather, gather. And a consumerist society is one that is, I think, profoundly unethical, and one that is damaging the natural world. We have a throwaway culture. We replace things really quickly. We expect to have a certain level of consumption. And I think we need to challenge it. And I think that part of the role of Christian tradition and religious traditions more generally is to challenge these kind of paradigms. So in the biblical model is perhaps Exodus 16, the story of the manna. God provides miraculously this manna from heaven for the Israelites to feed them. But the instruction is to take as much as you need, just as much as you need, no more. If you don't need more. And what they found, the Israelites, was when they took more than they needed, it didn't keep overnight, it rotted. So it's a real valuable lesson that actually God was providing, and they should take what they need and not more. And that's a word, I think, into consumer society. The value of integrity is something that we see kind of constantly eroded. But what about honesty, transparency, trustworthiness. And I think that's something that perhaps should be addressed to business, to commerce, to multinationals, to organizations that have power, to politicians, to politics. Where is integrity? Where has it gone? And how can we recover the kind of integrity that meant that someone's word was their deed and that there was a transparency and an honesty? Interestingly, yesterday on the news, they were interviewing I can't remember who it was that had lied, had lied to Parliament. Sorry? Thank you, Esther Maffei, thank you. And she'd lied to Parliament and she'd apologised. But the commentator was saying, it used to be that if a politician lied to Parliament and they were found out, they resigned. But that seems to be gone, and it's this truth-telling that evaporated in society. I think this has huge impact on environmental issues where kind of deceit and making things happen the way you want them, massaging the truth, are happening all the time. And finally, I want to talk about wisdom. Two kinds of wisdom in traditional Christian ethics. There's what's called practical wisdom, what you might call prudence. How do we do things? How do we address these problems wisely? And then there's the hope in God's wisdom. This is a quote from Celia Dean Drummond, a leading environmental ethicist. The need for a wisdom ethic for the environment stems not only from a requirement for practical wisdom or prudence in complex environmental decision-making, but also the need to bring hope in an uncertain world. I suggest that this Christian virtue of hope is critical in framing environmental decisions, for without hope it would be easy to give up on our responsibilities out of a sense of despair. And of course, wisdom and creation are very closely linked in the Bible. In the Old Testament, wisdom is in Proverbs 8 described as being there as a part of God's creative process. And in the New Testament, Jesus is called the wisdom of God. So this understanding of wisdom, both as God-given practical action and also wisdom of God himself and over his creation, are two sides to the angle of wisdom that we need going forward. And I think Celia Dean Drummond makes a very valid point when she says we need both, but we need the hope that comes with the wisdom of God. Otherwise, we find these problems too big, they make us despair. And I know my time is up, so there I am going to end on that hopefully wise note from Celia Dean Drummond, and thank you, and open to questions.
Thank you, Hilary, very much. And as she says, we're now open for questions, so if you have a question. Yes, Maureen.
Thank you for that. Basically, I was wondering, I've read a book called The Groaning of Creation.
Called?
The Groaning of Creation, and one of the things that was being discussed in the book was this idea about predator and prey relationships, and what some atheists would have it that if God was all powerful, why would he create this type of environment where you do get those types of relationships? So I was just wondering, what was your take on that idea?
That's a really great question, and I think that's something that theologians wrestle with. There's a great book by Chris Southquake called The Groaning of Creation. Is that the one you were thinking of? Okay. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions. Why do we have a kind of biological system that depends on prey and predation? My sense is that is... There are two things I'd say. First of all, I'd say that the Bible doesn't seem to have a problem with this. So if you read Psalm 104, it's basically a psalm about sort of, life cycles and habitats and so on. And predation is not seen to be something that's negative. And that counters some views that have been current in Christian theology that predation is something that came in with the fall and the death didn't happen before then. I don't think that's the biblical picture. I think the biblical picture sees ecosystems and life cycles for what they are, and it sees nature red in tooth and claw, to use the old expression. So obviously for the biblical authors it's not a problem. So it seems to be more of a modern problem, and it seems to be an increasing well, there are two strands to it. First of all, there's the strand of what I call squeamishness about watching something die. And so a lot of people, and apologize if you're in this category, but I'm going to say it anyway, a lot of people only like to eat meat if they don't know where it comes from. As a vegetarian, I say that's not a great reason for eating meat if it's only vacuum packed. But you read of kids that don't know that a sausage actually was once a pig. And so there's this disconnect, and so we're very squeamish. And there are certain channels where they no longer show the actual moment a lion kills an impala because people have written and complained that it upset them. So we live in that sort of society that's not willing to confront this. I think, though, also, in many, the systems of evolutionary biology depend on prey and predation. And it seems to be the system that works. It's the system that has evolved Homo sapiens, life, intelligent life, and that has always depended on life cycles and prey and predation. So I kind of feel that it is part of the system, and God is bigger than the system as a whole, and the system is bigger than the individuals. And yes, individuals within it do suffer and die, but you can tell I'm fudging a little bit. I don't have an easy answer, but I don't have the same problem with it. I don't think it's a sign that God is not God, or God is not who God says God is, that it's something much bigger than that.
Okay, another question? Yes, there's a question here.
Thank you so much. We live this kind of ethical problem in my state because we have a lot of environment problems. We have like 3 years without rain in some states in Brazil. I live in the third poorest state in there. We have a lot of problems with agronomic problems. We have some difficulties to have water. And in my laboratory, we found a way to know which are the best crosses to do in an improvement program of plants. And I have worked with some superior kind of plants to do a better plant for my state. And I want to know what you think about that. We have some kind of anthropocentric vision, but also a necessity, a big necessity. And
so when to do what was your project to do?
Yes, I analyzed chromosomes to do a better variety, a better crop.
Better crop,
yes,
more disease resistance,
yes.
and so on.
Disease resistance and more productivity. We have a lot of superior kind of things for this plant.
So this is genetic
yes,
modification, yeah.
but it's not in the molecular view is a classical approach.
And this taps into a whole big debate that has been very vociferous in certain quarters of the conservation community about genetic modified crops and organisms and so on. My own view is that actually ever since the beginnings of agriculture, farmers have been working to improve their crop strains and done it by the conventional methods of harvesting seeds and cross-pollination and so on have produced increasing domestication of wild plants is what agriculture is, and farmers still do that, and people that grow flowers in their greenhouses also do that. There may be people here that grow particular strands. So that what we have to be careful is that we don't suddenly have a knee jerk against something that is done at a a smaller level, at a genetic level, where we don't have that problem if you're doing it at a mechanical level. So it seems to me that there's sometimes issues there. From my point of view, the ethics of modifying crops so they have better yields, they need less water, they are more disease resistant in order that you can feed more people is a very worthy and valuable thing. And I'm not at all meaning to suggest that I'm against doing things that serve human needs, because actually, as I said, the Bible also talks about that. Where it becomes a problem is in some of the cases that we have read about, which I don't know if that is still the case or not, where the seeds are deliberately owned and controlled by Monsanto or another corporation. Because it seems to me that if you're going to produce seed that can be used for better yield, you need to have a just mechanism of making that available to often small-scale farmers, and not just keep it in the hands of agribusiness. So that would be where the ethics, I think, comes in more, is on the use of that, and whether there are companies that are hijacking that for their own profit rather than making it available. So, yeah.
Okay. Renee, there's a question. There's a microphone behind you.
Well, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. This is a very big question I have. So you explain, and rightly so, I think, the morality, and also from a Christian perspective, to have a certain view on the natural living world. Now, many people in my environment, they will say, well, this is a very beautiful story, but it doesn't change the actual behavior of human beings. And that's why we are going on, we are buying into the economic policy making approach. So having these markets for the emission rights. So they say, well, we do have this moral impetus or this moral motivation, but without this economical framing of the issues, it's not going to make any difference. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I said in my talk that I thought that economics was a good servant but a poor master. And I think that if I unpack that a little bit, I feel that where economics is unquestioningly the driver of everything, then we lose a moral framework. And so the ethical questions need to be being asked over and over again, and the ethical framework needs to be being put out there, whether it's a religious one or even leaving aside some of the religious language, about how the questions about how and why we value nature need to be being asked. And we, in a way, perhaps those of us that are more ethically aware and that think more in ethical terms need to be the ones asking them. And they are being asked in conservation biology circles by some. And they need to be asked more. And there needs to be more engagement in the debate. Now, at the end of the day, it may be that economics is going to be an important factor in how we do things. I would like to think that it isn't the only factor. And there is a small but growing move of people that are really challenging the prevailing economic structure and trying to look beyond it for alternatives. There are sort of various working groups, a working group in the City of London, I know, that's trying to think outside of the box. Now, whether something different could ever come along unless there was a complete worldwide economic collapse, the banking collapse hasn't produced a huge amount in terms of ethical change as far as I can tell. So I think economics is going to be with us for a long time, but I do also think we need to be asking the ethical questions, and that we shouldn't let people get away without thinking about those ethical questions.
There's a question behind you, Ruth.
Thank you very much. That's such a wonderful presentation. While you're presenting, I was just having it in my head, thinking of my zoologist friend, thinking that I'll be able to pass this message across to him, who is a pastor as well. But I was just thinking he might have some objection or some questions for me. So I would like to ask that question. Now, I'm just thinking about how animal could be like holding us to ransom, for instance, mosquito.
I didn't understand.
How animal could be holding us to ransom, right? I will give example. Malaria, for instance, or mosquito in Africa and some other regions like South America. You can't actually be in your garden at night because of mosquito. You have to be indoor. That's number one. So there is this like kind of you've been held ransom in your own, held down in your own house. That's number one. And there's this proposal for extinction of mosquito. So what would be your response on that in relation with what we are learning
no,
now?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a difficult question. And malaria mosquito is probably one of the examples of the biggest threat to human life from any wild creature. You could say the same, I suppose, about sort of smaller organisms, bacteria and viruses as well. But there's also a problem there. I think that science is right to work at eradicating these terrible diseases that are caused by biological species. So, for example, we've eradicated smallpox by vaccine and so on, pretty well around the world, I think. In terms of the malaria mosquito, I really liked the research I read that was talking about a genetic modification that effectively makes the mosquitoes sterile. So I guess eventually that would eradicate the malaria mosquito. But the problem, of course, comes in it's not just the mosquito, but what happens to the species for whom mosquito is prey. If you got rid of all the mosquitoes in the world, because none of us like mosquitoes, even if they don't cause malaria, you would then have a gap, if you like, in an ecosystem, because there are massive numbers of bird and insect species that depend on mosquitoes as part of their source of prey. So do you see that there are issues there? And of course, one gap in an ecosystem, other things come in to fill it. So the danger might be also that more harmful species might come in to fill it. So it's a tricky one, but I think if the research to effectively render malaria mosquitoes ineffective comes to something, then that would be really positive. And the alternative, of course, is to do what they're trying to do, which is to bring out vaccination across. But I don't think it's easy to get vaccinated against malaria, is it?
Okay, one last quick question. Peter, you had your hand up.
Yeah, very quick question and maybe a very short answer. Do you see any principal difference between driving an organism to extinction or modifying it genetically? In that way, in fact, creating a new organism in place of the original one.
Well, it may be a question with a simple answer, but it's one I haven't actually thought about. So, interesting. I'd like to ponder that. My intuition is that it's driving a species to extinction by destroying its habitat and its livelihood and its food chain. It is got many more sort of ethical and theological problems. So the example I told you of the northern white rhino, where there's only 2 females in the wild and 1 male, actually what the test tube baby they're planning to create is taking the sperm of the northern white rhino and mixing it with eggs from a southern white rhino. So it will be a slight subspecies anyway. But I think that that would be preferable to seeing them both go extinct, seems to me. So I think that is a preferable. But then there are all sorts of questions around genetic doing of anything that we can't go into now. So thank you for that question. I shall ponder it.
Okay, thank you again, Hilary, for a very interesting talk and all the questions.